All right, good. All right, everybody. Thank you for being here promptly. It's still a little early. It's still a couple of minutes early, so I won't formally start, except to tell you tonight's the second to last session of our semester. Next week will be the last session. I will let some of you know. I realized when I didn't have a lot of people on earlier that there were people who were probably following the Laker game. I have been told by my wife that the late it's at the half.
Don't tell anybody because maybe they're recording.
Oh, if it, I won't tell you if you're recording. All right, but they're at halftime now. Okay. Okay. And tonight, I'm going to try and do what I did last time. I'm going to give you all an opportunity to talk and to discuss the material that we've read tonight. I apologize. I realized that there was a lot of material to read. Interestingly enough, our discussion is going to be rather simple, but there was a lot of interesting material to read. So as I wait for one more minute, thank you all. The holiday of Shavuot will be occurring this coming week on Thursday. Thursday evening, I think, marks the beginning of Shavuot. Thursday and Friday of this week. So just to let all of you know. And Shavuot, of course, marks the end of the counting of 49 days, the 7 weeks. And it marks the period of time, those 50 days from the time the Jewish people left Egypt to the time they came to Mount Sinai and received the revelation at Mount Sinai. So we have come to that period of time between Passover and the end of this week. We've come to the 50 days. 50 days is rather long. All right, good. All right. All right. Start in just a moment. Now, to spare you from having to hear another review, I'm not going back and reviewing again. Hopefully you're all about it. We're all at the same place. We are coming to the end of the book of Numbers. We're coming to the last part of the story. And following the book of Numbers, we have the whole other book of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, which we won't get to right away. But we are making good progress. All right. All right, I think we're ready to begin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Let me review where we were last week, just so you know where we were as of last week, and then we'll go on. You remember the last couple of sessions, the Jewish people are progressing. They are marching toward entry into the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, the promised land. And as they get closer and closer to the land, a group of tribes surrounding the land of Israel begin to worry. At first, the two Amorite kings, Sichon, king of the Amorites, and Og of Bashan, they see the Jewish people coming. The Jewish people try and persuade them that they're friendly. The Jewish people say to Sichon and Og, we only want to pass through your land. We are going to the land which our God promised us, the land of our ancestors, the land of Canaan. If you allow us to pass through quietly, we will follow the direct route. We will not stray from the main highway. Any food of yours that we might eat, any water we might drink, we'll gladly pay for. Just allow us to pass through your land so we can get to the land God has promised us. Of course, the two Amorite kings say, no way. You may say you're peaceful, but we're not going to let a large Israelite force pass through our land. That's insane. And so these two kings, Sichon and Og, say to the Israelites, not only you are not passing through, but they actually raise a force, an army, both of them, to stop the Israelites from passing through their land. And you will remember that the Israelites first defeat the king Sichon, the king of the Amorites, and then in another battle that takes place shortly thereafter, they defeat his northern neighbor, Og, king of Bashan. So Israel is now all set to enter the land. The only problem is that the people who border right on the land of Israel are the Moabites. And the Moabites see what Israel has done to Sichon and to Og. And the king of the Moabites, a man by the name of Balak, says, we're finished. We cannot confront them. They have beaten every force that has come against them from the time they left Egypt 40 years ago till now. There is no force that can defeat them in battle. And therefore, the king Balak decides he's going to try a new strategy. He decides he's going to hire a Gentile, a non-Jewish prophet or seer or diviner, whatever you want to call Bilam. Balak decides to hire this famous non-Jewish seer, and he says to Bilam, look, the Jewish people are approaching my land. They're numerous force. I know I can't defeat them. No one stopped them. Therefore, I want to hire you to come and curse the Jewish people for me, because you are a very famous seer and you have a reputation that whoever you curse is cursed. God listens to you. God will do what you say. So he says to Balak, do me this favor, come and curse the Jewish people. And perhaps if you curse them, I, unlike the previous kings that they've confronted, I may be able to save myself and my people. I may be able to beat them. Well, you remember Balak sends the messengers. They come to the prophet Bilam and they say, our king Balak wants you to come and curse the Jewish people. And initially, Bilam says, I can't do that. I can only curse people who God allows me to curse. I may have powers, but they're not my powers. They're powers that are given me by God. And therefore, stay tonight. I'll see what God's intentions are. If God will allow me to come with you, then I will go and I will do what Balak requests. I will curse the Jewish people and maybe he'll defeat them. The messengers spend the night with Bilam, and in the middle of the night, Bilam has a revelation from God. And God says, who are these men who have come to you? And Bilam says, these are representatives, these are officials from the king of Moab, the king Balak. And he has asked me to come and curse the Jewish people for him. May I go? And God answers Bilam and says, under no circumstances may you go. He said, this people not only is not to be cursed, this people is blessed. God informs Bilam, this people is blessed by me, and under no circumstances are you going to be able to deliver a curse upon them. So you remember the next morning, Bilam gets up, he sends the messengers away and says, no, God won't let me do it. He sends them back. Balak sends them back a second time and says, please, please, please come and do this for me. I'll make you very, very rich. Bilam asks God a second time. Poor Bilam, he doesn't realize God doesn't change his mind. God is not a human being that he changes his mind from moment to moment. So Balak says again, can I go with these men? And God this time says to Bilam, look, if you want to go with them, you can go with them. You can go with them to Balak, but you can only do what I let you do. You cannot curse the people. You can only speak the words I will put in your mouth. Nothing else can you do. So Bilam the next morning informs the messengers, good news, God says I can go with you. He doesn't add the second part. He doesn't say I can't curse. He doesn't say God will not let me curse you. All he says is I've spoken to God again, and this time God has given me permission to go with you to back to your king. So Bilam is on the way with the messengers and his servants. And you remember the story, on the road is an angel of the Lord. God is very upset with Bilam because he never really told the messengers of Balak the truth. He made it appear as if he was going to curse. He never repeated Balak's words, God's words. You can only do what I tell you to do. Remember the story of the donkey on the road? The donkey sees the angel of the Lord. He turns away. Bilam starts hitting him. The donkey finally opens his mouth to his master and says, Master, why are you hitting me? I'm your donkey. Have I ever done this to you before? And Bilam gets into this discussion with the donkey. He said, well, you're frustrating me. You know, if I had a sword in my hand, I would have killed you. And the donkey then says in this kind of dialogue, he says, have I ever done this to you before? I've been your donkey all of these years. Have I ever been, have I ever refused to do what you told me to do? And then suddenly the gaze is lifted from Bilam's eyes and he sees the angel of the Lord and he realizes that the donkey has seen what he has not seen. Well, to make a long story very short, Bilam goes to Balak. He appears before him. He tells Balak, yes, I've come, but I can only do what God allows me to do. And Balak says, fine, maybe you'll convince God to let you curse him. So there are three different places where Balak tries to build altars. He builds 7 altars, different positions. And after he's built the altars and offered up the offerings, he says to Bilam, all right, go ahead and curse them. And 3 times Bilam tries to curse the Jewish people. And each time, well, we assume he tries, each time he gets a message from the God, and the message he is forced to deliver is not a curse at all. It's a blessing. And you read these beautiful speeches, and each time Balaam ends up bestowing a blessing upon the Jewish people. By the third time Balak has had it, he said, look, what are you doing to me? I brought you here. Made this great offer to you. You could have made yourself rich. I brought you here and hired you to curse the people. And you turn around these last three times. And after building the altars and doing everything I was supposed to, you turn around and bless them. And Balaam says, look, there's nothing else I can do. I can only speak the words that God lets me speak. And therefore, I have had to do what I've had to do. I have delivered these blessings. Balak at that point is so furious. He says to Balaam, go home, go away. I brought you to curse. You didn't curse. You only blessed them. You're no use to me. Go back. And this is how the portion ends. It says that when he is sent away, when Balaam is sent away by Balak, let me see here. Let me find the page. Yeah, here we go. Okay. All right.
That's wrong with the Post-it note.
Yeah, I know that. This is the point where I should have had posted notes. Finally, he says, Balaam speaks to Balak. If Balak were to give me all of his household of silver and gold, I cannot transgress the word of the Lord for good or for bad. Whatever the Lord speaks, that I must speak. And now, behold, I will return to my people. Come and I will tell you what will happen to you in later days. And Balaam speaks one more time. And the prophecy that he gives is a prophecy, as God says, telling Balak that Israel is going to be victorious and Balak will be defeated. Finally, at the end of this entire episode, we are told, then Balaam rose up and went away and returned to his place, and Balak went on his way. So at the end of the story, after attempting to curse the Jewish people, after failing 3 times, after saying to Balak, there's nothing I can do, I can only say what God tells me to say, Balaam returns to his home, Balak returns to his kingdom, his people. Okay, now we ended on chapter 24, verse 25. What's very interesting is what comes immediately after, and I'm just going to read this quickly to you. Okay, you've already read this yourself. The people of Israel settled at Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. If you're saying, what do they mean by harlotry? Sexual excess. You're talking about ritual sexual excess. They invited the people to the feasts of their gods, meaning the Moabites invited the Jewish people to the feasts of their gods. The people ate, prostrated themselves to the gods. Israel became attached to Baal Peor, which was the name of the major god, and the wrath of the Lord was flared up against the children of Israel. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people, hang them before the Lord against the sun, and the flaring wrath of the Lord will withdraw from Israel. Okay. So something has happened. God is angry. The reason we know God is angry is at the end of this story. Moses said to the judges of Israel, let each man kill the men who are attached to Baal Peor. Moses sees what's happening. He sees the rebellion in the camp. He sees the people going astray. And then we are told, behold, a man of the children of Israel came and brought a Canaanite woman near to his brothers in the sight of Moses and the entire assembly. Okay. Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, Pinchas was the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, stood up amid the assembly, took a spear in his hand. He followed the Israelite man into the tent and pierced him there, both him, the Israelite man, and the woman, into their stomachs. And the plague was halted from Israel, from the children of Israel. Those who died in the plague were 24,000. Okay, so let's review quickly. Immediately after Balaam leaves, immediately after his curses have turned to blessings, the next event we are told is that the Jewish people suddenly go astray after the Moabite women in whose midst they have now come, okay? And you would think to yourself, what on earth are they doing? Why on earth were the Israelites, and this wasn't the previous generation, this wasn't the slaves from who left Israel 40, these were their children who had been raised in the desert. They're coming to the land. They've finished their 40 years in the wilderness. They're right about to receive the promise that God has given them. And they're just on the eve of having success. We are told that they go astray, that they are attracted to the daughters of the Moabites who attract them, who entice them, who lure them. They engage in sexual indiscretion, which leads to them consorting with these women, eating in their feasts, and worshiping their God. So Israel ends up doing immoral sexual practices, conversing and becoming close to their non-Jewish neighbors, and finally worshiping their non-Jewish neighbors' gods. Now, if you are thinking to yourself, what on earth is going on? You're in good, you're in good company. Why would Israel suddenly, after all the success, just in the following verses after Bilam has blessed them, why would Israel go astray and go after the daughters of the Moabites and worship their God? Okay, I'm going to allow something here. Okay, okay, here we go. All right. And the answer simply is because they were following the advice of Bilam. Now, if I asked you and I said, in your reading of Bilam, does he seem like a good guy or a bad guy? Most of you would probably say Bilam seemed to be okay. There was nothing that seemed to be wrong with Bilam. He was a prophet, not a prophet to the Jewish people, but he was a seer. He interpreted God's word to the non-Jewish world. Bilam was very successful. God had made him very successful in beginning to interpret the future and then being able to bless and to curse. So Bilam is not presented initially as being a bad guy. He is a man with his own power. And when Balak goes to hire him to curse the Jewish people, again, Bilam is honest. I can only do what God lets me do. If God doesn't let me curse them, I can't curse them. It doesn't matter how much riches you give me. It doesn't matter how much you honor me. I will be unable to curse the people if God does not permit me. So he says the right thing. And he goes with the messengers. And when the time comes and he has to deliver his words 3 times, he blesses the people. Again, Bilam doesn't seem to have done anything wrong, right? After Bilam leaves, he tells Balak, look, I did what I had to do. And he goes, that's the last we hear about him until a little bit later. What could Bilam have done that was so terrible that it would cause Bilam's death later on, as you'll see, but also would cause the Jewish people to go to war now with the Moabites and the Midianites? And the answer is that Bilam was crafty. He said, I can't curse the Jewish people. God will not permit me to curse them. He said, I cannot pronounce a curse on them. That I can't do. But I can provide an insight and certain information to Balak and to the other peoples. And Bilam does the following. He tells the Balak and the Moabites and the Midianites, he says, if you want to curse the Jewish people, if you want the Jewish people to be defeated, there's nothing you can do that's going to defeat them. God has blessed them. There's no way to turn it around. God has made it very plain that he's not going to let these people be cursed. If you want the people to be cursed, you've got to do something to turn away God's protection from them. If God is protecting them and blessing them, there's nothing you can do that's going to be able to defeat them. It's all written, it's all foretold, it's all settled. But if you can somehow convince the Jewish people to do something so atrocious and so outrageous that God, in response to their disobedience and their falling away from his command, turns away from them, then Bilam said, you have a chance. I can't curse them for you, but you can get the Jewish people to do something that'll bring a curse on themselves. See? I can't curse them, Balak. No outside force can defeat them. But I'll tell you the trick as to how you can get them to defeat themselves and make them vulnerable. Now, from what you know about the Jewish people, there are a few things that are guaranteed to cause calamity. If the Jews engage in any one of them, it's going to be disastrous. The worst of these sins that they can commit is what? Someone, now we can start it. Someone want to tell me the worst they, go ahead, Lori.
Commit adultery and worship idols. And he also says, well, you know, if Moses can marry a Moabite, then it's okay for you to consort with them.
There are 3 sins in Judaism that you are under no circumstances allowed to commit, under any circumstances. Judaism normally says that if it's a matter of life and death, a Jew can violate the other commandments of the Torah, but there are 3 commandments of the Torah that a Jew can never defy, even if his or her life is put at stake. They must choose death rather than violate the commandments. And Lori is correct. She mentioned 2 of them. Idolatry. Idolatry is a big no-no. Even if the Jews are told, you know, otherwise we're going to, you know, this and this will happen to you. We're forcing you, you have to reject your God, you have to worship these idols. Jews have to be willing to give up their life rather than violate the command against idolatry. Okay, very certain. The second commandment concerns certain unpermitted, impermissible sexual relations, okay? And there are a whole series on them, but basically they are incestuous and unnatural acts that God says to the Jewish people, these you must never violate, it's an abomination. And Jews are told, if you are given the choice between saving your life or violating one of these sexual prohibitions, you must give up your life. You may not, under any circumstances, violate these sexual prohibitions. By the way, the third sin that the Jews are not allowed to commit is shedding blood innocently, shedding innocent blood. If someone comes up to me and puts a gun to my head and says, all right, Rabbi House, I'm going to shoot you unless you take this gun that I'm giving you now and shoot so-and-so, a third party who is innocent. The rabbi say, I must be willing to give up my life rather than do that. In other words, for every other sin in Judaism, except for idolatry, murdering an innocent, or these forbidden sexual acts, I must be prepared to pay the ultimate price rather than violating God's command, okay? So now you understand what the 3 major sins are. Now let's talk about the past. Did the Jews, up until this point in the story, this is up to you now, had the Jews ever committed adultery before this point in our story? Anybody want to tell me? Had the Jews committed an act of adultery up to this point? Okay. Anybody can, if you remember an event in the previous studies, go ahead, Lori.
Was that with the golden calf?
It's
When they
certain-
were making the golden calf and they were also doing the inappropriate sexual acts, was that the same time?
It certainly sounds like the golden calf may have been one of those times. Remember what happens when the golden calf, Moses is gone for 50 days. The Jewish people are worried. They convince Moses's brother Aaron to build a calf. Moses's brother does that. The calf is not supposed to be a god. It's not a foreign god. It is supposed to be take the place of Moses, to be an intermediary. Aaron builds the calf. He presents it to the people. He says, this is your representation of the God of Israel. Now you may worship him. The people immediately who start worshiping him, but they engage in frivolity. They engage in unacceptable behavior. Is it idolatry? Say the rabbis, no, it's not idolatry. Why? Because they weren't worshiping the golden calf, okay? Anybody who tells you that the Jews were guilty of idolatry because they worshiped the golden calf are incorrect. The Jews were seeking a physical representation, a physical intermediary between themselves and God. And so they asked Aaron to build this calf. Did they worship it as an idol? No. Did they worship it as a foreign god? No. They didn't even in their worship, they built that calf. Some people came and celebrated and worshiped the calf, but not as a foreign idol, as the God of Israel. Now, it is true that some of them began to engage in sexual, a little promiscuity, but nothing forbidden. None of the forbidden acts that are talked about. For example, If they had engaged in adultery, that would have been forbidden. If they had engaged in incest, that would have been forbidden. They did revel and celebrate, but they didn't engage in physical acts. Go ahead, Mike. I see your hand.
Wait a minute.
I was on a comment on that they were not worship. They had been without Moses for a good period of time, and Moses was, their connection to God. So they didn't know how to connect to any kind of God. The only one they knew was an idol, so they built the calf as an idol, hoping that they could connect to God in lieu of Moses being there. And that was, they weren't really worshiping the calf.
Very, very good, Michael.
Yeah.
The calf was built to replace Moses, but not as an object of worship. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So the situation, Lori, that we mentioned, the golden calf, was not an act of idolatry. Was there ever any other act of idolatry mentioned in the Torah? Anybody? Did anybody ever see another act of idolatry? The answer is no. The Jewish people never, except for the golden calf, which was not really a false worshiping foreign god, Jewish people never committed an act of idolatry. Did the Jewish people ever revolt? Yeah, the Jewish people did revolt. We know 2 times already. They revolted when the spies delivered their report, right? And they revolted again when they challenged the leadership of Moses. But in both those revolts, the Jewish people did not revolt for selfish reasons or for wrong reasons. They revolted because they were scared, they were hungry, they were thirsty, they were disappointed that they couldn't go into the land. When the Jewish people had revolted in the past, they weren't revolting against God for no reason. They were simply expressing their anxiety in revolt against their own leaders. But this time, the Jewish people revolt against not only God, but against God's commands. They not only join with the Canaanite women, they not only serve the Canaanite gods, including the god Baal, the Canaanite god Baal. They not only do all that, but they actually end up rejecting the Torah. It looks as if this time the Jewish people are going to be finished, right? There's nothing that can save them. The only reason that they were saved previously, the only reason that they had not been destroyed previously, was because Moses, their leader, had interceded for them. He had stepped forward and said to God, who was angry with them, God said, leave me alone, I'm going to destroy them, I'm going to punish them. Moses said, God, you can't do that. If you do that, the Egyptians will think you didn't have the power to bring them into the land. If you do that, then you forsake the promise that you made to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that you would return the children to the land. Moses tries and prays and tries to convince God, and succeeds, not to destroy the people, to allow the people to continue on and to go with the people to the land. But this time, when the Jewish people revolt against God by cohabiting with and engaging in sexually immoral acts with the Moabite daughters, and actually go from there to actually offering offerings and serving Canaanite gods, there's no mitigating factor. There's nothing that Moses can say. As a matter of fact, what does Moses do? Does anybody want to tell me what Moses does in response to this? You saw what Pinchas did. What did Moses do? Anybody? He does absolutely nothing. The amazing thing is that Moses, who is at the end of his leadership, who's already been told he's not going into the land, Moses doesn't lift up his voice against what's going on at all. Imagine this. Moses is there. The people of Israel are by Moab. They don't know about Balaam. They don't know about Balak. They just know they're coming close to the land. They're about to go into the land. Suddenly, the Jewish people go whoring after the daughters of Moab. They go worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. Moses is witnessing it. He's seeing these people, and there are no extenuating circumstances. There is nothing Moses can say on behalf of the people. He can't say these are the slaves. These are people who left slavery, who fell back into slavery. These people were the generation that had been born after 40 years, during the 40 years of wandering. Moses couldn't say it really wasn't an act of idolatry, because it was in fact an act of idolatry. They were offering up idols to Baal. Moses couldn't say they weren't doing anything sexually prohibited. They were engaging in ritualistic prostitution with the priestesses of Baal, and they were engaging in permissible sexual activities. Moses had no words that he could offer on behalf of the people. Nothing that he could say to God was going to mitigate God's anger at this point. And God was angry. How do we know that? A plague broke out while this was going on, and 24,000 Jews were killed. They died as a result. Question is, there was nothing that Moses could say, but the interesting thing is he didn't even seem to make an attempt to stop it. And we could puzzle about why. Why was Moses so dejected at this point? Had he just given up? He had lost faith in the people. He saw them as rebels. Moses, go ahead. I'm sorry. Someone want to answer? Oh, yes, go ahead, Marlene.
Wasn't it because he had married, was it a Moabite or wasn't he really old? But
Yeah, first of all. Good.
yeah, but anyway, so he would have been more of a hypocrite than anything, because here he had done it and he had married, I mean, he hadn't, but so he didn't do anything.
So what Marlene is saying, and I'll respond to Marlene. Marlene, you can go quiet now for a second. What Marlene is saying is exactly correct. You remember that Moses, many years before, when he had first fled Egypt, married the daughter of Jethro, who was a Midianite. So Moses, without being a hypocrite, couldn't say to the people, why are you mingling with these Midianite women? Because the people would have said, what are you talking about, Moses? You married a Midianite. We're connected with these women, but how can you tell us not to have relations with the Midianites and the Moabites? You yourself married someone who wasn't an Israelite. How can you forbid us that? So what Marlene is saying here is Moses couldn't say anything because he would appear to be a hypocrite. But Moses doesn't even try. He doesn't become indignant. He doesn't say he couldn't say, don't marry the women, but he could have said, why are you offering idols? Why are you sacrificing sacrifices to their God? Moses says nothing. As a matter of fact, no one seems to do anything until the grandson of Aaron, a man by the name of Pinchas, gets up. He sees what's happening. He sees the people turning away from God. He sees God in anger turning against the Jewish people, killing many of them, 24,000. Pinchas looks to see what's going to happen, and nothing seems to be stopping this. And finally, when one of the Israelite chieftains brings a Moabite woman right into the midst of the camp and right in the presence of everyone, including Moses, goes into a tent and begins to have sexual relations with her, Pinchas cannot stand it. He's watching it and he sees what's happening and he says, this can't be allowed to stand. So what does he do? He picks up a spear. He goes into the tent while the Israelite man and the Moabite woman are cohabiting, are having relations together. And he stabs the both of them through the stomach. He does both of them at the same time by jabbing them with the spear. They're dead. Now, if you're going to say, Rabbi, is this normally allowed in Jewish law? The answer is no, it's not normally allowed in Jewish law. What Pinchas did is not an officially sanctioned Jewish act. Pinchas didn't seek it. If he had gone to Moses and said, Moses, what should I do? Moses could not have told him, take a spear and run them through. Only God can authorize that. But Pinchas doesn't wait to hear from God. Pinchas goes in, sees what the two are doing, sees the offense that they're committing in the sight of all the rest of the Jewish people. And in his anger, as a zealot, he takes a spear and he kills both of them. Pinchas becomes the first zealot. Now, if you're going to say to me, is it right for a person to be a zealot for God? In other words, is it all right in the name of doing what God wants to kill people? That doesn't sound like Judaism. That sounds like other religions where they say we have to avenge God's word. We have to do God's will. We have to kill the apostates. Judaism doesn't normally allow us to take individual self-action to deal with apostasy, to deal with these kinds of things. Normally, the situation would be the courts would be convened. The people would have to appear before the courts. They would be judged. And when they were judged guilty, they would be executed. Okay? But Pinchas doesn't wait for any of it. He goes into the tent and kills them both. And then after he kills them both, you would think, oh boy, Pinchas is in big trouble now. What do we read in the very next portion, the beginning of Pinchas? What does God say to Pinchas in response to his action of taking a spear and running through both the Israelite man and the Moabite woman? Anybody want to tell me what God says to Pinchas? How he punishes him? Go ahead, Gary. I'm sorry, not Gary, Michael.
He punishes him by making him and his family priests.
Yeah, I punish you by making you my priest forever, and I bless you and I reward you. Contrary to what we would have thought, and by the way, Pinchas is one of the few zealots in Jewish life who ever gets away with it. If you're going to be a zealot for God, you better be doggone sure you're doing what you're doing for God's sake and that God will approve. Because if you do it for any other reason, if you try and tell you people, I'm doing it for God, I'm doing it on God's behalf, if you're not absolutely certain of it, you're in big trouble. But Pinchas does this, and God looks at Pinchas's action and he says, as a result of Pinchas's actions, God says, I have spared the Jewish people. I have not only removed the plague from them, but what I would have done to them if someone hadn't stopped my wrath, I turned it away. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the Kohen, turned back my wrath from upon the children of Israel when he zealously avenged me among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my anger and my vengeance. Therefore say, behold, I have given him my covenant of peace. It shall be for him and his offspring after him a covenant of eternal priesthood, because he took vengeance for his God and he atoned for the sins of the children of Israel. Michael is right. God deals with Pinchas's act of zealotry by rewarding him. By the way, do you know of any other instance in the Bible where God rewards an act of zealotry on behalf of a Jewish leader for an act that he does, even though God never commanded it? There is one other famous incident. Many, many years later, in the time of the prophet Elijah, in the time of Elijah, the Jewish people are also going astray after foreign gods. They're also becoming involved with foreign women. They're also being led astray. And it's because of the priests of Baal. So Elijah conducts a gathering of all the Jewish people, and he invites the priests of Baal, and they have a contest on the top of Mount Carmel. And the contest is to see whose offering God will accept. Well, they each make an offering. God doesn't accept the offering of the priests of Baal, but he does accept Elijah's offering. And when he does, Elijah turns to the people and say, all right, now slaughter all these priests of Baal. And they do. Okay. Another act of zealotry, another act that God did not command, but it was clear that God approved of what Elijah did, that God accepted Elijah. Here's my question to you. What makes an act of zealotry permissible? Normally, we are not allowed to act in a way that defies Jewish law, even if it is to protect the honor of God. What is it that allowed Pinchas to slay this Israelite man and this Moabite woman? What is it that allows zealots to do things that they're, technically speaking, not supposed to do? Anybody want to tell me? All right, before we get into that. Okay, go ahead. Jerry, go ahead.
I guess specifically Zimri and Cosby were engaged in an act at the time that Eleazar's son terminated them. So I suppose you could reason if he had done this not at that time, but waited a couple days, then that probably wouldn't have been an act of zealotry that would have been rewarded.
What Jerry is saying is very important. Pinchas did not have the time to sit back and wait. Had he done nothing, had he gone through the legal process, this thing would have escalated and gotten much, much worse than it did. Pinchas's argument is people are dying. Israel is on the verge of a great revolt against God. It's obvious God is angry. I have to act now to do what I have to do. And he probably would have thought, it's time for me to act on behalf of God. These people are violating the law of idolatry. They're violating the law of mixing with the nations, other nations that are not part of Israel. They're violating the laws of sexual immorality. They are violating all these laws. The leaders don't seem to be able to stop them. Moses is not saying anything. I can't just sit back and let this go on. I've got to do something. So Jerry is saying here that the justification for it is there is no other alternative. It's a matter of life and death. And Pinchas acts to stop the actions. Anybody else? Agree, disagree? Yeah, people are shaking their heads. Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's clear from what God says that God accepts what Pinchas has done. It's clear from what the rabbis later say in the Torah that no one should ever take Pinchas's action as a model for what you should do. Jews are never told to be zealots. Okay. There were zealots in Jewish history. When people acted. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
You're right.
Mhm.
But there are zealots who do things and they're not good things. Like, I mean, Sachs mentioned it, like, killing the prime minister of Israel because he had a feeling that he didn't want him to do something. Things like that, which are morally wrong. But, I guess this was okay.
Okay. All right. Mother, you can.
Yeah, that was, Sachs went into so much of this, page after page after page. And it was really deep, and he had a hard time with it. He had a real hard time explaining it. So we had a hard time with it.
Right, so let me see if I can what Sachs was saying. The reason Sachs has such a hard time with it is there is no moral right for anybody to cite the example of Pinchas or the example of Elijah and say, if they could do it, I could do it. The danger of zealotry is so great that anybody who claims to be acting on behalf of God and doing things that would not be allowed, and the only reason they're doing it is because they were doing it for God's sake. God spoke to them, or they needed to do it to stop it. Anybody who does that in Jewish life is violating Jewish law. No Jew can ever act as a zealot. As a matter of fact, in the times in Jewish history when zealots arose and they did these kind of acts, it always brought disaster upon the Jewish people. You may not know it, but the second temple was destroyed because of the acts of the zealots. You think you're doing it for God's purposes. A person sees what's happening and thinks he's going to act on behalf of God, but inevitably, the person is not acting on God's behalf. They're acting out of their own selfish idea of what God needs at this time. If you have the chutzpah, if you have the nerve to see yourself as God's avenging angel, and you intend to punish someone or to visit someone with retribution, and you say, I'm doing this on God's behalf, you had better be 100% absolutely certain that you are acting on God's behalf, because the lesson of zealots is almost never is their action acceptable. Almost always, except on a 1 or 2 occasions, zealotry is not acceptable to God. And the reason is because Judaism is a religion of law. Judaism is a way of life based on law. How can we, with a Torah and 613 commandments and courts, how can we sanction people to behave in an illegal manner? How can we say it's all right for a person to take the law into his or her own hands? There's no justification for it. You can't do it. And even if you try and come up with some kind of a rationale after the fact, well, I did it for God and there was good reason for me to do it, and this person had it coming, our act of zealotry never has a legitimate sanction from God. Now, if someone were to tell me, You mean to tell me, Rabbi, if someone had a gun and went up into Hitler's headquarters in the Reichstag and assassinated him, God would have been unhappy? I can't know that. But I know that even in that kind of a case, although there would be plenty of Jews who would think that that would be the next example of someone who did a right act of zealotry, zealotry is not allowed in Jewish law. You are not allowed to act as the agent of God. God has his own agents. God works out justice on his own. Sometimes it's not as fast as we would like to see it. Sometimes the guilty seem to get away with murder. Sometimes the innocent seem to suffer. But if you decide, I am going to become God's, not only his mouthpiece, his legal representative, I'm going to be his executioner too. I see what this person is doing. I judge them guilty and I'm going to kill them. You are now in dangerous, dangerous territory, because except for Pinchas and Elijah the prophet, every time it happened in Jewish history, it was disastrous. It always turned out badly. Even if you can say, I understand his justification, I understand why he acted, I understand why he did what he had to do. It was an urgent situation. Jews were dying. It was a flagrant violation of God's law. No one was stepping forward. He had to act. The truth is, you can't do that. By the way, for those of you who are wondering, Moses couldn't have said anything either, because if he'd said something to them, to Pinchas, someone would have said to Moses, yeah, who gave you permission to kill the Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew slave? Moses couldn't have defended himself either. Moses himself had acted in passion and in anger and slain someone. God didn't tell him to slay him. The Egyptian was beating the Hebrew, but he wasn't necessarily killing him. Moses became so indignant, so angry that he slew him. That was Moses's great gift, that he hated injustice. But Moses was not a model for what Jewish people. We cannot follow Moses's example. We cannot decide this is against the act of God. This is a law against God's law. God would want this to stop. Therefore, I, as an agent of God, I, as a representative of God's people, I, as a member of God's nation, am going to take action on God's behalf. If you do that, you have committed a sin. Committed a sin, without question, okay? Except in those very few instances where God himself says, I see what was done. And given all the factors involved, not only am I not going to punish this man, I'm going to reward him for it. But be very careful. Be very careful when you do that, because when you act like God, you take on a big responsibility. Now, this is a very important point, because now it comes to the end. Notice in this last scene, Moses has abdicated responsibility entirely. Moses doesn't even put up an objection. The last scene we see that involves Moses in this book, the people are sinning. The people are committing idolatry. The people are fornicating. They're having sexual, impermissible relationships with Moabite women who they were prohibited from having any relations with. Moses doesn't protest. Moses doesn't chastise. Moses doesn't try and stop them, even though it is clear with 24,000 Hebrew deaths that God is not happy with what's going on. Moses kind of just falls into a reaction of inaction. He does nothing. Moses doesn't do anything. None of the judges of Israel do anything. No one steps forward. The Jewish people go astray, and it takes the actions of one man, Pinchas, to say, this is not right. This has got to stop, and it's going to stop right now. What is your reaction to Pinchas's deed? Anybody? Go ahead. Anybody want to speak here either for or against Pinchas? Okay,
I
Mike.
will.
Go ahead.
The only thing is that he saved a lot of people's lives by doing that. So that's why he did it. He tried to save everybody's lives.
Okay.
I still, though, Ron, I still can't understand how they could all do this. They were so close. They were so close to the promised land. And then they did this. And how many thousands of people died? More than 24,000,
24,000 at the time of the plague, 24,000,
the plague,
but more than that.
yeah.
Marlene, let me answer your question. How could they do it? They could do it because Bilam, this is the end of the story of Bilam, knew something that no one knew. He knew that the Jewish people was God's people. He knew that God protected the Jewish people because they were his covenant people. And he also knew that God protected them because they followed God's law. Bilam says to Balak, you want to get rid of these people? I'll tell you how do you do it. You get their God so angry at them. You get God so furious with them, so angry at them, that you won't even have to fight the Jewish people. Just get them to sin and God will finish the job himself. God will take care of it all by himself. So Bilam goes back to his home. What does Balak do? He recruits the Moabite women. All right, I want you to now go out and I want you to fraternize with the Israelites. Go and invite them, go and be intimate with them, go and eat with them, go and invite them to worship your gods. And sure enough, the Jewish people who for 40 years had been cut off from other people, they've been in the wilderness, they go crazy. They're now with other people, the Moabites. They now have a chance to socialize. They now have a chance to be intimate. They now have a chance to commit idolatry and other kinds of crimes. And given the first opportunity, Marlene, given the first opportunity, they fail. What Bilam has taught Balak is, I cannot cause God to curse Israel, but Israel can convince God to curse Israel. He says to Balak, I can't do it. You can't do it. But you want to know something? By their actions, they can bring curse on themselves. And that's why Balak gets this bad reputation. It says later, because Balak was the one who delivered the message to, Bilam was the one who delivered the message to the Moabites and the Midianites. If you want to get rid of the protection of the Jewish people, have them do something so heinous, something so awful, that it is an absolute transgression against the law of their God, and their God will no longer protect them. And that's exactly what they do, Marlene. So how could it happen? I don't know how it could happen. It turns out this people wasn't very strong after all. You're right. 40 years, they're there, they're almost there, they're right on the verge. They first come into contact with the Moabites, and the first thing they do is they go astray. It doesn't seem possible. But then again, I could tell you that happens with Jewish people a lot. We are a lot of times we go astray. What do? Things are good for us, things are going well, and we are our own worst enemy. We engage in activities that cause us to violate God's law, which results in God's taking away his protection from us. And suddenly God is no longer protecting us. We have this covenant with God, but the covenant is a two-way covenant. God says, if you violate my Torah, if you violate this law that I have given to you, then there are consequences. And if the nation as a whole violates it, God says the consequences are going to be dire. Okay, as we will see later on when the Jewish people as a whole later violate the law. So the answer to the question is, how could this happen? This is a lesson for the Jews throughout history. I think I've told you this before. No external enemy can ever destroy the Jewish people, okay? What we have learned from the from the books of the Bible we've studied so far is that there is no external force that against God's will can destroy the Jewish people. The only thing that can destroy the Jewish people is that they turn aside from God, they violate his covenant, they fail to do what he has commanded them, and then God himself will remove his protection from them. Now, if you think about that today, you realize why this is so important. Because Israel is faced with a lot of enemies today. Faced with Iran, it's faced with Syria, it's faced with this and that country. There are a lot of people who don't have goodwill toward the Jewish people. There are a lot of people who wish to do the Jews harm. And the Jews, as you might guess, are a little paranoid. They say everybody in the world wants to kill us. That prophecy of Bilam, I behold a people who dwells alone. That could be a blessing, but it could also be a curse. Everyone despises us. No one. If Israel, who is surrounded by enemies, turns away from God, then they're in trouble. So long as they trust in God, they cannot be hurt. They cannot be harmed. Now, I know that sounds a little facile, and you're going to say, How do you account for thousands of years of Jewish history? And I say for that, the very same reason, that it doesn't mean that other people weren't guilty. It doesn't mean that other people didn't commit terrible acts themselves, but they would not have had the impact they did on the Jewish people had God not allowed them to be vulnerable to these outside enemies. And the only way you can be vulnerable is if you fail to act in the way that God wants you to act. Go ahead, Jerry.
There seems to be a lot going on in this allegory that we can kind of reason on. In that, if I remember correctly, since the Levites didn't send out a spy, they were exempt. So Aaron, when he passed, would have been over 120. If he had another son, that whatever 80, and this grandson could be maybe 50 or 60. So he's a mature person.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of these people are young and inexperienced. And this isn't a personal anecdote, but I can kind of think of when the young college kids go on spring break, and then all the temptations that are there for them to indulge in to their own self-destruction. And finally, did you notice what the name of this place was called? It's spelled Shittim.
Shittim.
So could anything good happen?
No, it could only involve Shittim. Any of you who have had youngsters understand what Jerry is saying. Youngsters, they study hard, they work hard, then comes spring break or spring vacation or whatever you call it, and they decide they want to unwind. Where do they go to unwind? Someplace where they can blow off steam. What's their idea of blowing off steam? Someplace where the rules don't apply, where they can go, where they can hook up with other people, where they can engage in drinking and kinds of behavior that they would never think about engaging in a more normal setting. Their elders would warn them, this is not smart, this is not good. By doing this, by behaving in this irresponsible way, by throwing off all the rules, you are bringing upon yourself terrible potential disaster. But they do it anyway. The Jewish people were kind of like on summer vacation. Suddenly they have all these Moabite women around. Suddenly they have all this temptation. Suddenly they're sleeping with them and cohabiting with them and worshiping their gods and committing all these different crimes and violating the Torah. And they get it in Shittim, in Peor. That is where the judgment is given. Now, I don't want to draw any other parallels except to tell you this. There are times in Jewish life when it's no correspondence between punishment and action. But there are a lot of times in Jewish life where the actions of the Jewish people can sometimes bring about unwanted results because of their own disregarding of their obligations as Jews. Okay. Am I telling you that God will strike the Jewish people every time one individual sins? No. Will he strike the Jewish people every time 10 individuals sin? No. Will he smite the Jewish people when many Jews in different nations individually sin? No. But when the Jewish people collectively sin, and when their leaders don't stop them, and when no one is there to chastise them and to bring them up and to say, you cannot keep going this way. You cannot continue to act as if you are not bound by God's law, as if you are not required to follow this Torah that you've accepted, then they place themselves in great danger. And there are many Jews today who don't feel compelled to observe God's law. Will God punish the entire Jewish people for that? No. But depending upon what the reaction is of the Jewish community to these kinds of acts of rebellion and disobedience, God will or will not be more likely to protect and defend the Jews as a whole. Okay. I don't know why individual Jews suffer. No one does. And the whole idea of the book of Job is, We know that sometimes good people suffer for no sin of their own. Don't say that everybody who suffers did something wrong and they deserve to suffer. It's not true. We don't know the reason. But as a collective, as a people, God says to Israel, all the other nations of the world that arose when you arose are gone. There's no more Egyptians, there's no more Babylonians, there's no more Assyrians, there is no more of these ancient nations. They've come and they've gone. The fact that you, Israel, are the only nation that goes back these 30 some odd hundred years, and that you still are alive when much powerful and much mightier nations than you have disappeared, the only thing that accounts for it, God says, is my covenant with you. If I took my protection from you, if I lifted up my hand from you and allowed you to be subjected to the people around you, you wouldn't last very long at all. You would be gone before you know it. It's not your righteousness that, well, it's not your might or your power or your great numbers that protect you. What protects you is your faithfulness to a certain way of life. If you turn your back on it, if the people as a whole forget the purpose for which I call them into being, then I, my God, make no promises. I will let all kinds of things happen to you and you will have only yourself to blame. Go ahead, Lori.
So I guess we have to do our part to be good Jews to make up for the other people who don't.
Here's the thing. That's the whole business of covenant. When you're a part of a covenant people, Lori, you're not only responsible for yourself and your actions before God, but you're also responsible for all those wayward Israelites who aren't following God's way. If you can step in and say, hey, people, you're not behaving correctly, you're not doing the right thing. If you could right the ship, if you could get people back on the right path and you choose to ignore it or don't speak, yeah, in a way, you are also responsible for what's going wrong. As we look around today, as I look at all of you on the line, you would not be the kind of people that I would say would lead to the destruction of the covenant between us and God. But when you realize that there are a lot of other people with whom we have influence, who we either will speak to or not speak to, you realize how powerful it is. Lori, it is a matter of being good. It is a matter of following the tradition yourself. It is a matter of speaking up and being a teacher, a guide, an advisor to fellow Jews. It is a matter of not only keeping yourself on the straight and narrow, but making sure that to the extent that you can, to the small influence that you have, you steer other Jews back to the correct way too. That is a correct lesson to take from it, okay? And it's not just the rabbis that do it, it's not just Moses that does it. You do it the right way. You do it by following the law yourself. You do it by encouraging others to follow the law, okay? But that's all you can do in the end. Joshua and Caleb, the two righteous spies, said to the people, don't do this, don't revolt. God is with us. If we go in, God will fulfill his promises. No one chose to listen to them, all right? The Jewish people brought disaster upon themselves. We should strive to be, Lori, those of us who understand this lesson, we should strive to be people who speak on behalf of the tradition and on behalf of God and his Torah. All right, this was somewhat disjointed today. I hope in the end it all makes sense. The next week we're going to deal with the lessons we've learned from Numbers. It's going to be called, and I'm going to ask you to do one thing. Compile, you read the last reading and compile every lesson you can compile about leadership or about being a follower, being a Jew. Find all the lessons you can in the book of Numbers. Okay, see if you can go, when you go through the book of Numbers, maybe I'll send out a question or two to you. See if you can find what we can learn about leadership, what we can learn about community from the book of Numbers, from Moses's actions, from the actions of others. That will be our theme for our last session next week, okay? Okay, and with that, anybody is free to say what they would like or not. All right.
You gonna stay on, Rabbi?
I'm sorry. Yes.
You gonna stay on?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll stay on. So don't go away. Yeah. Yes, Jerry.
I noted that at the end of last week's lesson, you had drawn attention to a theme of God's limit of patience. And
Yes.
this was, I thought about this allegory along this understanding of God's limit of patience.
God can forgive a lot, Jerry. He can be convinced by Moses and wants to be convinced by Moses. He wants to hear arguments defending the Jewish people. But there are certain instances where God cannot turn his back on it. It cannot forgive it, okay? We've already seen that. When Korach and the rebels rebel against Moses and against Aaron, we see that God delivers punishment upon them. Korach and his band are burnt with fire. Datan and Aviram are swallowed by the earth. Certain people, when they commit certain acts and they have the opportunity to go back and repair the damage, if they choose not to, God is not going to be patient. And I guess that's the lesson, Jerry, that God does have a limit.